Hi, everyone, and welcome to Quest a Career, a video series where we uncover the untold stories behind the careers we admire. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Jennifer Pollitt. She is the Assistant Director and Assistant Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Temple University. With a PhD in human sexuality and over 15 years of experience as a sexuality educator, her research explores sexual agency, reproductive justice, and the intersection of sex, law, and policy. My favorite part, all while analyzing how pop culture serves as one of the most powerful, informal sources of sex education in American society. She has designed sex ed curricula for institutions like the University of Sciences and Princeton University, and her insights have been featured in the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Post, and Psychology Today. Dr. Pollitt, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the podcast. If there's anything you'd like to add to that introduction, please feel free to do
Oh,
so.
thank you so much. I'm so jazzed to be here, especially on such a nice day. So I would say, yeah, you did a great job on highlighting some of my accomplishments and areas of expertise. One of the other, or two of the most important parts of my work too, sex ed is the big umbrella that I operate from and use a lens to apply it to a whole bunch of different things. But
Mm,
I also am a men and masculinity scholar and do a lot of work with sexuality and disability. So my work centers on just making sure that all of us across all of our backgrounds and identities have access to comprehensive and quality sex education information about ourselves, our relationships, our bodies, others. Yeah, it's my favorite part of my work.
very
I
cool.
also love
Awesome.
cats and snacks.
Cats and snacks. Great. Well, yeah, let me ask, who are you? That was your professional bio. If you were to describe yourself outside of that realm, how would you describe yourself?
Yeah, I would say that I'm kind of a goofball. I know that we have like traditional notions of what like academics are, and maybe we think that that's, how they behave in their personal lives
Mm,
too. But I would say outside of Temple, I mean, a lot of my work comes home with me, in ways that are really fulfilling and meaningful. So because I have a PhD in human sexuality, I just think about relationships a lot, and
mm,
so. Um, I'm a little boring. I'm a little goofy. I love reading. I love walking around the city of Philadelphia. It's one of my favorite places on earth.
mm,
And so I feel like as long as I'm here, it's my perfect little bubble. Some of the other things I love to do are just visiting family and friends, spending time with people like in the real world, especially it becomes, harder and harder. We're all attached to our screens. So, and then, yeah, I really do love any furry animals and spending time with them too. So outside of work, I'm not that much different than inside of work, but I try to focus more of my energies on, yeah, on just maintaining and making sure the relationships that I have in my life that are not just work related are thriving and fulfilling and satisfying because that's what fills up my cup.
That's amazing. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Um, Looking at your career so far, right, with a PhD in human sexuality, advocacy work, being a professor at Temple, I'm curious if this was all part of the plan, so to speak, right? Like, I'm thinking about Dr. Pollitt, you being super young and thinking about who you wanted to be. Yeah, what drew you to the interests you have today?
Yeah, it's been a really circuitous journey. I did not have a straight line, despite the fact that I thought when I was young that I knew exactly from a very young age. I was like, oh, I know exactly what I want to do, and
Mm,
I'm going to take each of these steps to get me closer to that goal.
mm,
But so when I was a kid, I'm an only child, and I was the first
mm,
grandchild to working class family. My dad was a truck driver. My
mm,
mom worked in an office and, granddaughter of immigrants, Hungarian immigrants. And so I was really close to my family and community when I was a young kid. And at like the age of 10 or 12, at age 10, my grandfather was diagnosed with cancer.
mm,
And I was really close to him as being like his, pride and joy as the first granddaughter.
mm,
Um, And so through that, I spent a lot of times in doctor's appointments, hospitals. Though my grandparents both spoke English, medical words were sometimes difficult to understand or discern.
Mm,
And so from a really young age, I was able to like take care of him and help out, and that felt really good. So I thought like, hey, I'm going to be a doctor. And I
mm,
loved science, and it just lit me up, and it was so exciting. And so I loved taking all of the science classes I could. And from that moment on, I volunteered in hospitals. I used to prep in high school. I used to prep ORs for different surgeries so I could get to watch them.
wow.
And I was never grossed out by like blood or guts. So
Mm,
I was like, this is what I'm going to do with my life. I really want to be a helper. I want to be in medicine. And that's not exactly the doctor I turned out to be. So, in my undergrad career, I went to the University of Sciences and I was a STEM major. And I loved the science in my classes, but for me, there felt
mhm,
like a disconnect between the science and the helping.
mm,
I felt really conflicted. I didn't really
mm,
feel like there was like necessarily like a space for me there. I didn't know how I could best use my abilities to help and to be a helper. I also
mm,
recognized like quickly that what I understood, I didn't have growing up, I don't have any doctors in my family, medical doctors in my family. I didn't have like the insider perspective. I
mm,
didn't understand like kind of how the institutions and like the mechanics of things worked. And so the more and more I got to learn about, like kind of the guts of everything, the more and more I was wondering, like, is this actually the right path for me? At the time,
mm,
I was also like experiencing some health stuff of my own and feeling a little bit down on some of the interactions I'd had within that system.
mm,
So I graduated from college with my STEM degree, and I didn't end up going to medical school, despite the fact that since I was like 10 years old, that was like all I wanted to do. And I was also, as the first person in my family to go to college, there was a lot of pressure on me to like figure it out. We're spending a lot of money. My
mhm.
parents sold our childhood home and moved in with my great uncle so they could relieve some of the financial burden
Wow.
of a college education. So I also felt like, don't screw this up. So I graduated from college feeling like I had royally screwed it up.
Mm,
I had set my expectations and my parents' expectations that I was going to be an MD doctor. And
mm,
then I graduated and I ended up not doing that. So I felt
mm,
really lost and confused and angry at myself on graduation day. And I thought that it was like supposed to be the straight line. I thought like, of course, you go to
mm,
college, get the job or get into grad school, and then your whole life is set by the time you're 22.
mhm,
That's not how it worked out. I wandered around for a couple of years, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to go back to school. I knew that I liked school. I enjoyed being in
mhm,
school. I didn't know if I wanted to go to school for STEM. At the time, part of the way I put myself through college was being an optician, so making eyeglasses.
mm,
And that was like, I actually still love, love, love opticianry, the optics, and working with patients and,
mhm,
getting them exactly like the eye care needs that, they need. So, when I was an optician and I was wandering around, my boss, who actually also just happened to we became good friends, he was
mm,
going through a divorce. And at the time, he was just starting to date again. And he called me up one day and he said, "Hey, Jen, you're never gonna believe this. I just went on a date with a sex doctor." And here I was, like a serious scientist, right? And I was like, that's not a real thing. That sounds ridiculous. And I thought
mhm,
that he was just like pulling my leg and joking around. And so he said, no, like I promise it's like a totally legit thing. And I was really
mm,
like resistant to, this idea. And so I said, no, it's not. And he said, well, you want to bet? Like, sure, we can make a bet. I bet you this is not a real thing. And this is,
yeah.
20, I don't know, it was 20 years ago. So I wasn't exactly like
Mhm,
Googling or I don't know. I
okay.
forgot the internet existed.
Yeah.
And so I bet him that it wasn't a real thing. He bet me that it was. And if I lost the bet, then he dared me to go to Widener University's open house. So I
Mm,
clearly, I lost the bet. Widener
mhm,
University has a PhD in human sexuality. It's actually the only accredited PhD for the study of human sexuality specifically in North
wow.
America. The program is over 25 years old now. And so here I was going to this open house. And I felt so naive. I was green as the grass. I didn't really have a liberal arts education. I went to the University of Sciences.
Yeah.
So I knew the biology, maybe the anatomy and physiology, but all of the other things, in the biopsychosocial model, the psych and social parts,
Mhm,
were
mhm,
lacking, or humanities perspective too. And so I went to the open house. At the time, the director of the program was Dr. Betsy Crane.
mhm,
And I met her, I shook her hand, and from the moment that we connected, I just suddenly felt like my feet were glued to the ground. I felt the sturdiness. I felt like the universe open up and say like I have no idea why you need to be here, but this is the thing that you should do. And
What was it about your meeting with her or being there, right? Because I'm imagining that you must have you must have been thinking about these larger questions about human sexuality, maybe in your own personal life. And I'm curious what it was about this meeting with Dr. Crane,
Mhm, yeah.
um, that made you feel so drawn to this field and this journey and this path.
Yeah, I've done a lot of thinking about this, now 20 years on. We're almost 20 years on. And at the time, also, I felt like there was this tension when I was in college.
Mm,
I grew up and was raised Catholic, and I'm an elder millennial. I don't love the term geriatric millennial that's been making its way around, but and so I had a lot of I had recognized that I had felt same-sex attraction from the time that I was like a teenager, but
mm,
I was also really scared of that.
mm,
And so I did a lot to kind of push that away. I had a lot of my own internalized homophobia that I refused to even like acknowledge. And so I think that like I had been struggling with that in my own
mm,
way, but like really under the surface. And so when I went to this open house and I met Dr. Crane and I was looking at these courses and she was telling me about this program, I felt like she was speaking to a part of me that I was so reluctant to speak to myself.
mm,
And it just felt like a place where maybe I could explore parts of my life that I had not necessarily had a framework. I could trick myself and be like, well, this is for school.
mm.
This is for research. And
Yeah,
so it made it feel a little less
something
scary,
honorable, something,
something honorable, right?
yeah.
This wasn't just like for my own selfish reasons or,
Mm,
it could help me, understand the world better, meaning
mm,
like my inner world, but I wasn't necessarily as connected or aware of that at the time. And so, and I'd always been interested in people.
mm,
And so whether it was like, being in a hospital and like helping take care of my grandfather, who I inevitably ended up dedicating my dissertation to. So
mm,
I did become a doctor, just not the kind that, I think we thought
oh,
I'd be. But I realized like, wow, this is actually like pretty cool. I'm really interested in helping people. I'm interested in relationships. And also, like Dr. Crane is just like she's still my academic mentor, but mom. She's like my second mom. We are
mm,
still super close and in touch all the time, and she's always like on my shoulder and whispering in my ear and helping guide
mm,
me. But my body had felt so disjointed
mm,
before I'd met her. I felt like I was grappling with something, and as soon as I met her, suddenly like my shoulders relaxed. I could take a deep breath, and it was the first time that
mm.
I'd like kind of experienced this full body sensation.
Huh.
So I enrolled and I was terrified because I felt like I knew nothing. I was sitting in classrooms with folks who'd actually like had degrees in gender, sex, and women's studies or in sexuality or public health. And
Mm,
here I was coming in like, thank you for letting me be here. But it was the single greatest decision that I could have never anticipated, like
mm,
even having the opportunity to make had like my boss not gone on a date with someone who was getting a PhD in human sexuality from Widener University.
mm,
And it not only changed the trajectory of my entire professional and academic life naturally, but it changed the trajectory of my entire personal lives and has
mm,
enhanced all of the relationships I have with my family, with my partners, with my, loved ones and colleagues and, strangers on the street. So it was personally like one of the most satisfying experiences that I've ever
mm.
had without knowing that I needed to have that. So it was a super happy accident.
It's interesting that you describe it as a full body sensation. Because as I think about people in the world that are on these random paths and are looking for signs that will propel them into where they want to go or where they're meant to go, so to say, that's a testament to saying that like the body can really be an important source of like uh what's the word? Like an important source of nudging you towards where you need to go. So that's really interesting that you say that. And so maybe students or people should trust their bodies in these situations.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer, and it took me, it took me years to kind of develop this framework and this language, which I now like have used in my classroom for really long time. But we live like in a culture that teaches us not to trust our bodies or bastardizes our bodies or weaponizes our
Mm,
bodies or tells us that our bodies should be producing in a certain way or should look a certain way
mm,
or, shouldn't behave in a certain way. And so there's all these messages that we get about our bodies, right? And especially in a digital age where in some ways we're becoming more and more disembodied because more of our
mm,
lives are being lived in digital space and in real life space. And so for me, like on my path, if I look backwards now, all of the choices that I've made that have worked out that I could not have planned for, it's because I listened to my gut. My gut
mm,
said, don't go to medical school. I don't know if this is going to work out for you. I don't know if
mm,
this is going to be good for your body. Um, and then my gut said, go to Widener and get a PhD in human sexuality. We don't know why yet, but we're going to figure it out. And then even when I was at Widener, I was like, okay, I'm at Widener. I'm getting a PhD in human sexuality. I'm feeling more comfortable in this, and I'm going to be a
mm.
researcher. And I want to be in the back of the house stuff. I don't want to
Mm.
teach. I had no desire to teach whatsoever. Was not part of my
Really?
plan. Not on my radar. I've never wanted to be in education. I've never, despite getting a PhD, I wanted to do the research. I was familiar and comfortable with doing research, whether it was, STEM research or now more social science research. But I never, ever, ever wanted to teach. I didn't see myself as a professor or a teacher. I saw myself working for like a research institute or, doing a lot of writing, spending a lot of like kind of time with my thoughts and, conducting studies. And so I stumbled into teaching, and that was a happy accident too. I had
Mm,
dropped out of my PhD program 2.5 times. So for for students who are not only undergrads thinking about like what do I do after I graduate,
mm,
recognizing that like getting a PhD or being in grad school, can have starts and stops too. That's also not a straight line.
mm,
Um, and when I finally graduated, I was super proud. My dissertation committee gave me this giant push over the, finish line. And Betsy Crane said to me, "You're going
mm,
to teach." And I said, "No, I'm not." And she said, "You're going to teach. Don't worry. That's what you're going to do." And I was really resistant. I did not want to believe her. And very shortly after I got my PhD, I ended up at a Christmas party.
mm,
My partner at the time, her mom would have like this really rad holiday party, like kind of around
mm,
Thanksgiving, Christmas time. And it just so happened at this party was a sociology professor at Temple who had learned that I had just recently graduated with my PhD and was, congratulating me and said, "Oh, hey, by the way, we have these two courses that just opened up that we need
mm,
to have covered for the spring semester. Like class starts in like 2 or 3 weeks. They're human sexuality and gender in America. Do you want to teach them?" And I had been like, complaining and moaning, like, I have no idea, like, how am I getting a job? This is so
mm,
scary. And my partner at the time looked at me and said, like, "You're absolutely going to do that. I know you don't want to teach, but like this just fell in your lap." And so I felt like I could not say no.
mm,
So, it's not an easy path out in the job market for
mhm,
someone with a degree in human sexuality. And so it's not always, it's complicated to sometimes figure out like, how are you going to get paid? Where do you fit? It's a unique kind of discipline
mm,
situated within higher education. And so she said to me, like, "You have to do this." And so I said, "Okay, I'll do it. Like, I guess I can't sit on the couch." And so that was the first
mm,
full semester long course. Those are the first full courses I'd ever taught.
mhm.
And as soon as I stepped foot in that classroom, I was like, "Oh my gosh, I love this. This is exact." I had that exact sensation in my body that I'd had when I met Dr. Crane, when I met Betsy.
Why didn't you want to teach? Because I'm thinking about you right now. I have you for class, and I think you are an amazing professor, and I think your personality aligns with that of, a charismatic professor. So I'm curious why you didn't want to teach. Was it is a self-belief thing? Was it I'm curious why.
Yeah, I was a really shy kid growing up. I
Mm,
was born like pretty premature. I was scrawny and scraggly. I was cross-eyed and, a kid who got picked on and teased. And
mm,
so I always preferred keeping to myself. It felt like a way I could protect myself. And so I was more introverted. I grew like out of that shell more, by the time I entered middle schoolish, high schoolish,
hmm.
but it was still coming. It was still I
Still
would
coming
still not
out.
consider myself extroverted. I liked being in
Yeah.
the OR
Mm,
where everyone was masked up and I could kind of be anonymous and blend in.
mm,
I liked being in my STEM classes, because there were very few times that you had to do any public speaking.
Mm,
Was afraid of my own voice in some ways, and I was much more comfortable providing the research or the resources that other folks needed to be able to teach their stuff.
mm,
So yeah, I think a little bit of it was I still felt kind of shy
mm,
and nervous in front of people. And the other part, growing up, and again, you can't be it if you can't see it. Like, I
mm,
didn't know anyone. I mean, besides my professors that I had,
mm,
I didn't have anyone close to me that ever did something like that before.
mm,
And so it was hard for me to see myself as like the person in the front of the room that like could impart things in
mm,
this way and that students, would listen to. And, I wanted to make sure always want to make sure that I'm doing a good job. And I
mm,
still feel insecure and I can have some imposter syndrome too. But I never
mm,
thought that I would be in front of folks because one, I really did also love the research. And so I loved kind of like, cocooning myself and writing or, doing a ton of reading. Once I finally picked a dissertation topic, like I would say that I struggled during dissertation, but I also loved it because I was just, completely in the zone
mm,
for all those months, the year that I was writing a dissertation. So for me, it was a little bit of insecurity. It was getting over, my own shyness. It was just hearing my own voice
mm.
and figuring out like how to connect and, make sure that I was creating a meaningful experience for folks. I
Experience.
take that really seriously, especially since I had so many like amazing professors that were able to create that for me. So I was like, I don't want to let them down.
Mm,
And yeah, so I just couldn't have ever imagined that I would be the one that was like teaching in front of the room. But
mm.
as soon as I stepped foot on Temple's campus, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that it's my job to get to talk to all these students all the time. Yeah, and now like, holy moly, here we are.
How did you balance expectations from your family and from the stakeholders? Because, you know, a lot of people have interests that they want to pursue. Like, I can imagine a lot of people going to that open house and saying, "This is what I want to do. This is a place where I feel community like I've never felt before, a part of myself that I've never experienced before." But they have other stakeholders, like their parents,
Mhm.
their younger selves that are expecting so much, whether that is monetarily, whether that is socially, right? I think it's pretty taboo to do something like what you're doing. And I can imagine that it required a lot of strength to, you know, be vulnerable and be like, this is what I want to do, and this is what I will do. So I'm just curious what that felt like for you in the moment, and I can't imagine that it was easy.
Yeah, it was especially because it wasn't like I was getting a PhD in kind of like physics, right? Or again, like STEM where there was like maybe a more direct line. Like this was a little bit more vague and abstract. And I'm also really fortunate to say that my parents, they they of course like wanted me to go to college and get an education, but that was never like they never said like you must go and do this. Like we will
Mm,
support you, to make your own decisions. And also like they never had gone to college. So they didn't necessarily know what it was about. And I was always like the kid who loved school. And so I was more like, I definitely want to go to college. And they were like,
mm,
cool, college, we're gonna go to college. Um, and they learned right along with me. So,
mm,
but once I got there, yeah, I felt really like I really wanted to make sure that, all the time and energy and support and money that they were pouring into me, that I wasn't wasting that. And I
mm,
remember like calling my dad and saying like, Dad, you have to come to Philadelphia because we have to have a talk about school.
mm.
And it was, the first time I had said out loud, like, I'm not going to go to medical school.
Oh my God.
And I was so nervous. They had given me so much so much in so many ways, but they'd also given me the power to make my own decisions.
Mm,
And I felt like, oh my gosh, am I making the wrong decision right now? But
mm.
something doesn't feel right. So I remember having that conversation with my dad, and he like didn't skip a beat, and he was like, okay, what are we gonna do next? And so I
Wow.
say that I was really fortunate and privileged to have that experience.
Mm,
That was very different when suddenly I graduated and I wasn't going to medical school, and 6 months later, the student loans were coming in,
Mm,
right? So have to do something, have to like get a job, have to figure something out. And so when I finally settled, I'm sure that my parents were, disappointed or a little heartbroken, the thought of having the first like doctor in the family
mm,
in this more traditional way. I just remember I was super close to my mom's mom, my grandmother, Oma, who was displaced during World War II, like so many others,
mm,
and then was fortunate to be able to come to the United States. And after I got my PhD, she understood like what a medical doctor was, but she didn't really understand this PhD thing. And so she had me write down that I had like write down so she could keep it in her purse. I wrote down Doctor of
oh.
Philosophy, and I left off the human sexuality part because there were a couple of bridges that were like too far. But she would carry it around, and she was so proud, and she would say, "Oh, my
Mm,
granddaughter, like look, this is
mm,
what she has." So I say that to say like it was confusing and there were struggles. And what I always try to remind my students about is. Um, and this is something that happened on my very first day of grad school in the very first
mm,
class that I took.
mm,
I'm a person like I've been like called like nicknamed like hashtag planner. Like I really like to have a plan for everything,
mm,
despite the fact that that's not how any of this has worked out. So on the first day of class, there was a woman who was now going to be in my cohort and my classmate, and she was 50. And she had two
mm,
children. She was recently divorced. She had been married to her husband for, decades. And now she was 50 getting a PhD and she was like starting life all over again. And I
mm,
was like, oh my God, that is my biggest fear and nightmare. Like,
mm,
I want to make sure that I have it all. I'm freaked out that I've like don't have it figured out now, just like a few years after college. Like, I should have had this already figured out when I walked across the graduation stage.
yeah.
Um, and so it was like really challenging for me to see her in this space. And I remember when we were introducing when we were introducing ourselves, she said, I'm really grateful to be here. In my, previous life, I was a, married, straight, mom of two daughters
Mm,
and, living my life. And now in this next part, I'm a, late in life lesbian pagan witch who's getting a PhD in human sexuality. And I was just like, what? And remember, this
yeah.
was like culture shock for me, right? Like
Yeah.
this was not something that I was used to. So we ended up going to lunch that day. And I said, like, oh my gosh, like you're
Mm,
so brave. How do you do this? And she said,
mm.
if we're fortunate and life is long, we get to
Life
live
is
many
long.
yeah, if we're fortunate and life is long, we get to live many lifetimes. And so that's what I did in that lifetime, and this is what I'm doing now. And if I'm so lucky, I'll get to have even more lifetimes after this. So
Mm,
going into class, I always remind my students, especially when students are like, well, Dr. J, like what's next? Like what's the next project you're working on? Or, where do you see yourself? And I said, like, in my previous life, I was like a biochemist and I made eyeglasses and I was like an optician. I said, in this life now, like I'm doing this. But I don't know that I'll do this forever. This is who I am at the moment. And, maybe in the future, I also love gardening and I love physics. Well, I don't love
mhm.
gardening. I love the idea of gardening. I, I haven't been able to keep a plant alive yet, but I'm working
Yeah.
on it. So I try to tell my students, especially when they're feeling the expectations from their parents, right? The financial
Mm,
expectations, like they want to feel that source of pride. Like, if you are fortunate and life is long, no, maybe you don't have the privilege
mm,
to major in the thing that really lights you up or brings you like the most joy in this moment, right?
mm,
Maybe there are obligations that you just can't escape out of or expectations that you are too afraid of not meeting. But
mm,
this is what you can do for now. It does not
mhm,
mean that you have to do this forever. You will have the opportunity, again, if we are lucky and life is long, you will have the opportunity to create multiple lifetimes for yourself.
mm,
And so, if you are lucky and you can make those choices, now do them. Listen to your body and move where it tells you it wants to go. But even if you don't have the space or ability to do that because of lack of resources or, again, obligations, expectations, etc., know that this isn't forever. All you have to figure out is what you're doing next. You don't
mhm,
have to figure out what you're doing for life.
mhm,
Because that for me always made me feel really stressed out. Like I felt like every decision I made from the time I was 12, right? I didn't want to like divert off the path. I didn't want to like make a mistake. I didn't want to set myself up for failure. I was so afraid. Like life is supposed to be set and then you're done and you don't have to make any more decisions. And it was really scary when suddenly like life wasn't set and I had to make those decisions. And
Mm,
so in that moment when, my still great friend and colleague said like, yeah, this is what I did before, this is what I'm doing now, and who knows, I'm gonna maybe do something totally different next. That's like one of the, really fortunate parts of modern medicine. For those of us that are lucky enough to be able to, have access to healthcare and to taking care of ourselves in all those ways. And so, yeah, I feel really grateful that I was able to use that framework. And that's something that's
mm,
really important for me to tell my students. So, even if you're feeling like super stressed out and pressured and you have all these obligations and expectations, just know that, like, one, sometimes you have the power to change that. And it's
mm,
scary, but you can do it. And so maybe you
mm,
have to call your dad and say, you have to come to Philadelphia. We have to talk about this.
mm,
Or to know, like, yeah, maybe I do actually just have to, power through and persevere in this major, in this job that I don't love, because it's going to set me up for whatever the thing is that I want to do next. Or it's going to open a door, right? Like, I wasn't being an optician because it was like my life's work or my career goal, but it was the thing that got me, to meet my then boss, which then set
mm,
all of these other things in motion. It was being in this like remarkable, amazing, loving, relationship with my former partner that got me to her mom's house for
mm,
a Christmas party, that got me to meet this professor at Temple, that then got me to teach at Temple. And that's part of the reason I love my work too, is that if I look back on all of like the decisions I've made that have actually worked out with me without me making a plan for it, it's just out of all the relationships that I've been able to cultivate.
mm,
And so that is the stuff that's not predictable. Every semester I have like, it's so exciting to meet all of you, all of these new
mm,
students that, I want to keep forever. And who knows, like, where our lives will all take us by those
mm,
intersections. Being able to collaborate with, my colleagues and, knowing like, oh yeah, well, this is like super cool. Like maybe I'll
mm,
like go and, meet a philosophy professor, or maybe I can collaborate over in, the law school, or
mm.
just all of those like meaningful, kind of genuine, vulnerable human interactions we have. Like that's the stuff that I've started to pay more attention to than the actual like bullet points on the map. Um,
Yeah,
and that's what's also gotten me to pay more attention to the sensations in my body.
yeah. I have that same narrative that I follow, which is we got time. Like, we got time. And I know that people feel like they need to have every part of their life planned out, but that's not how life works. You could have never planned everything that happened in your life specifically. But I think people, um, they face a lot of insecurity in that, right? It's not secure. If somebody wants, financial security, or they want comfort, or they want respect or status, right? I don't think it's sustainable in their minds for them to think, well, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do and then hope that through my relationships, like something's going to happen. But what I want to focus on is that you've demonstrated a skill in your life. And I think that it's a skill of having unexpected things happen to you, but for you to take that with such stride and react to it in a productive way for yourself, right? Like the whole thing with your boss, the whole thing at the party, like these are things that you didn't expect to happen to you, but when they did, you took that opportunity and you took advantage of it. So I'm curious, thinking about this sort of skill, what are, if you were to think of things that students could take away from these stories, and how can you be better prepared for the detours that life's going to throw at you?
Yeah, one, just know that there are always going to be detours, not only like professional detours, which I had many, but also personal detours. You don't
Mm,
know like the person you're going to meet that maybe you're going to like try to life build with, in a like romantic, family building, sexual way. You don't know about, the experience of grief and loss, right? Like look at all of us through the pandemic.
mm,
With so much uncertainty. So I think I've learned that like no matter how much you can try to plan, like there's just always going to be something that you cannot plan for. And so developing a skill of adaptability, and doesn't mean that you should be adaptable and like always just try to find the silver lining and, put on a happy face. It
mm,
means like recognizing, okay, in this moment with who I am now, what are my skills? What are my strengths? What
mm,
are my weaknesses or curiosities? Like, what can I learn from this experience? And that has been something that has really helped me. Also, we are like taught not necessarily like to trust ourselves all the time, and especially when we're young, right? Like there's just not enough like experience behind us to know our bodies as well, or to know kind of what fills up our cups.
Mm,
It's all kind of a mystery, and to approach that with curiosity. I think that, even when you said I'm curious about like what students can take away, I
mm,
think that one of the things to do is to continue to treat ourselves like a really interesting research project. So collect
mm,
data on yourself. Pay attention to, hey, what is it about this that is making me feel scared or uncomfortable or insecure or worried or fearful or challenged?
mm,
And then instead of like shying away from that, asking questions. Oh yeah, being like super curious. Huh, I wonder what that's about.
mm,
Why is like why are there knots in my stomach? Why are my cheeks getting like all red? Why am I looking down? Why am I fidgeting?
mm,
And treating it more like a thought experiment than trying to find certainty in it. In the same
yeah.
way, listening to your body, if it's like lit up, levitating out of your chair, and your brain is buzzing and your heart feels wide and open, be curious. Like, what is it about this, right, that feels really good? And for me, like, especially with medical school, what felt really good were the human connections and being
Mm,
able to help people. What didn't feel as good was kind of the scaffolding around me and like the disembodied feeling I felt in some of my STEM classes. Um, and the ways that I wasn't necessarily able to like play to all of my strengths and weaknesses. Like I just
mm,
want to talk to people and find out like, where are you hurting? How can I help you? And so for me, it's not like that different now. Like, oh, well, where are you hurting?
mm,
How can I help you? No, you don't have a broken leg, but like, where's the tender spot? How can I give you more resources or knowledge to help figure that out? Some of the other things to think about, and again, I recognize there's a certain amount of privilege of all of this.
mm,
And so some folks don't have, the space, and are in survival mode,
yeah.
not thriving mode, to take the time and listen to their bodies and make decisions like based on that position. And so if you don't have that privilege, then I would say recognize too, sometimes you just have to do the things that feel bad and you don't want to do, again, to get to the next step. And
Mm,
so there were plenty of times that I had to do that, especially throughout graduate school when it was not all hearts and roses, despite the fact that I've just sung its praises.
mm,
I also dropped out 2.5 times, and didn't know that I would ever finish, despite the fact that that was my plan. So I would say, be soft and gentle with yourself when you are
mm,
faced with a moment of, a fork in the road or a challenge. Think about like, one like practical tool that really helped me too to like drill down on this a little bit more is so while after, in college and then afterwards, I was also going through some health crises and issues. I
mm,
was not yet diagnosed with the rare autoimmune joint disease that I now now have had for, since I was 19 years old. But because of that, part of the reason that medical school seemed like it wasn't a good fit for me eventually is because I didn't know if my body would be able to physically handle it.
yeah.
And so in thinking about, and I didn't think about teaching, because it wasn't part of anything that like I even had an orientation point to. But once I started to learn more about or think more about the career that I wanted to have, and again, this is a privileged position,
Mm,
but, I tell students, think about like, what time do you want to wake up in the morning?
mm,
Are you a person that thrives on, having the stability of knowing like I get to go to a 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or 7 to 7? And I like knowing like, I punch in, I punch out, I don't have to take my work home with me. And I can do a really good job while I'm there.
mm,
Some folks like that amount of structure and to have some place to go every day that's not their home. For other folks, it's like, oh my gosh, like that is not something that works for me.
mm,
I'm someone who really needs more, project-oriented things. I don't want to do the same thing all the time. I want to be able to work on different things, or, I need my schedule to be more flexible, to be accommodating.
mm,
Again, and not everyone gets to have these things. But I need more flexibility to take care of myself or, my elderly family or my children.
mm,
Like what are the natural rhythms of your body?
yeah.
What feels better to you? And so I work a ton all the time, but because I'm in higher ed, I have to show up for when my classes are scheduled, when I have meetings, but by and large, I can control like when I'm doing all the work.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of having to report to the same place at the same time and saying like these are the hours that you're required to do this work in.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel really fortunate in that way. And because of that, it also has made me able to do more work and to be better at my work because it's not as much of a physical drain on me as it would be in like a different structure.
Mm-hmm.
So don't only think about like the kind of work that you want to be doing, but like how do you want to be doing that work?
Mm-hmm.
How? Like, do you want to be going to the same physical space every day where you see the same people, which is great, and you can like build those relationships? Do you want to be able to take your work like wherever you want and travel around?
Mm-hmm.
I love that I get to come to Temple's campus. Like, that's where I go. That's where my job is.
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
someone who is peripatetic and wants to pick up my laptop and like sit in the mountains and sit on the beach. So think about like, what do I want my day to look like?
Mm-hmm.
And then think about like, well, what is the career that you're working towards, at least for now? And like, what are the different ways that you can embody that career? And it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have to just look like one thing.
So cool. You're echoing so much of like what I believe. I think whenever I have conversations with people, I'm always like, think about your perfect day and
Hmm.
think about everything that would be in that. Like I work with students as an academic coach and kids that are, from ranging from 8 to 18 years old. And I always encourage them to think about what their perfect day would look like. That's one of the first questions I ask them in the sessions that we have. And according to that, we try to build a
Hmm.
life that they like and that they feel served by. So it's super cool that you said that. Um, I can't help but notice that you were extremely thoughtful and almost like existential in the way that you've moved around your life. And as somebody that also thinks like that, I noticed something in one of your articles that I'm gonna pin in the footnotes for people to read. But you wrote, in a world where we increasingly feel more polarized and disconnected from our communities, perhaps it's time we all sit with questions about what it means to be human. And you wrote that in one of your articles, and that was really profound. I want to ask you to expand on it a little bit. I also think that some people might listen to that or read that and think of it as kind of radical, right? Self-examination as radical in a time where it's so hard to be attentive and there's so much going on. So I just want to ask you to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that like the trouble certainly that I felt like I was in when I was in college and that I see now, being on the other side of it is right, you can get like tunnel vision because there's so much pressure and so much expectation. And so, right, like I had total tunnel vision. I was like, I'm going to be a
Mm,
doctor. And once like I
mm,
wasn't going to be a doctor anymore, like a medical doctor, I was like, oh my God, like this is terrifying. And so I wasn't thinking about like my own humanity. I was thinking like these are the steps I need to take to reach the goal and
mm,
not thinking about like whether or not I was just on the escalator doing that or if I actually wanted to do that. And so I think now, a lot of my work, because it's based in relationships, I have a PhD in human sexuality, but really that's just code for relationships. The relationship that we have to ourselves and the relationship we have to others. And I think in a time where, we are living in such kind of chaotic and noisy space, there are a lot of people telling us what we should want, what we should think, what we should believe. And it's really easy to get sucked into that. I do too. And
mm,
so one of the things that I try to remember and center for myself and in my work and impart to students is turn the volume down on the noise outside.
mm,
And so I want you to think about all the messages that you've received, all of the stories that you've been told, and think like, do those narratives and do those stories actually serve me?
mm,
About my gender, about my race, about ability, about, the class I was born into or the class that, I'm aspiring to be part of. Right? Think
mm,
about like, is this something that I want for me, or is this something that I am told I should want? And so by wanting it in that way, I gain access to, social rewards.
mm,
Because sometimes the distance between those things can like be pretty large. So I realized like, yeah, part of me also wanted to be a medical doctor because it would be like really prestigious and there'd be status and I would make my family proud. But really like what was more important to me was helping people. And
mm,
so whether I did that as a medical doctor or now as a PhD in human sexuality, like teaching students, like that's the thing that connected me to my own humanity. And usually like when I tell people that I have a PhD in human sexuality, some folks are like, whoa, that's super weird.
mm,
And other folks are like, oh, that's kind of cool.
Mm,
But no matter if they think it's cool or weird, usually very quickly afterwards, I get people leaning in, and there's always a lean in. Hey, can I ask you a question?
mm,
Right? And it is my job. I was trained to have conversations that are about the most intimate parts of our lives. Right. So I know that when someone is leaning in, someone who maybe fundamentally does not like the work that I do, or someone that is like
mm,
super on board, when they lean in and say, can I ask you a question? I know that they are about to share something that is intimate and vulnerable and that they don't have anyone else to talk to about it. And no matter what the question is, and I've gotten tons and tons of questions. I've been so grateful to bear witness to the tender parts of people's lives. But no matter what the question, no matter who it's coming from, there are a number of questions that are underneath it. What they really want to know is, am I normal? Am I lovable? Am I worthy? Am
mm,
I safe? And am I enough?
mm,
And sometimes, can I trust you? So that for me, like whether I'm talking about, yes, I'm using a human sexuality, a sexuality studies lens to start these conversations. And also, when you tell someone you have a PhD in human sexuality, it cuts through like kind of the small talk,
yeah.
right? You get
Yeah.
to more of the meat and potatoes of things. And so for me, I think that, you know, we are now socialized into, in some ways, systems that tell us like that we shouldn't listen to each other. You know, it's harder to connect with someone's humanity because we have all this manufactured outrage.
Mm,
But really, all of us, right? Who doesn't want to be able to answer yes to, yeah, I'm totally normal. I am
mm,
lovable. I am worthy. I'm enough. And there is nothing about me that disqualifies me
mm,
from the thoughtfulness, kindness, generosity, care, consideration of others. And if there is something about me that I do feel insecure about, or I feel like it's a flaw, oh my gosh, wouldn't it be amazing for someone to say, you know what? Like you're still okay. That still makes
mm,
you lovable. It doesn't mean that like, you can't want to do better or you can't adapt and change something about you that, you're maybe like feeling like I don't like this thing
mm,
about myself. But giving people, the assumption of goodwill in some ways to recognize
mm,
that like people might like do bad stuff, but people are not bad. And we can all end up like soaking in our own shame and guilt. And when we do that, some of us internalize it so much. And so we like recoil from the world. Some of us externalize it. And so it's like, I'm in pain. So I want to like enact as much
mm,
pain on you as possible. Others of us get really like defensive about that. And
mm,
so it can kind of be this back and forth. Like, I'm going to blame you for this stuff because it's easier than actually like sitting with myself. But I'm also
mm,
then going to punish myself for blaming you because actually it's my stuff. And so, in this world where we're trying to make sense of all this, and we are constantly, there's a fire hose of information, right? I think for me, like the question is like, well, what about like our shared humanity? Like
mm,
ultimately, we are in this all together. And no matter who I talk to, there's not a single person that does not want to have more intimate, satisfying, fulfilling relationships in their lives. Whether it's a better relationship with their kids or their parents
mm,
or their spouses or, their colleagues who like they haven't been able to collaborate with in like the most like productive and energizing kind of ways,
mm,
right? I think we're all seeking to like tend to some of those wounds that we have,
mm,
right? That like we didn't necessarily like realize even maybe when they were happening, or maybe we did realize when they were happening. And so like how can we tend to our own wounds so that we can then like be more able to tend to the wounds of others? And that's where I think that shared connection is. So I think by for me starting conversations about the stuff that's like considered like stigmatized or taboo, like sexuality, like pornography, like disability, like sexual dysfunction or
mm,
divorce or having a family member that's been incarcerated
mm,
or suffering or struggling with mental illness, right? Like talking about the things that like people feel like we shouldn't talk about because it might disqualify them from then being considered normal, lovable, worthy, and enough,
mm,
right? As soon as we can like start having those conversations, like that's when all of a sudden like there's this huge infusion of vulnerability. It's like, oh, you too, me too,
mm,
right? And that's what I think is kind of magical about some of the work that I'm able to do. And I'm super grateful to be able to bear witness to the experiences of all of the people in my life and hold space for that to recognize, like, yeah, me too. Like, these are the things I'm
mm,
super insecure about and messing it up. And I feel bad and I'm keeping myself up at like 3 a.m. worrying that
mm,
this thing, is going to disqualify me from, all that life has to offer. And so having someone to be like, no, you're okay. Like it's totally okay. And I will say, that one of my former partners, she's the one that really helped me
Mm,
come to terms with like it was totally okay to be queer, to
mm,
be in love with her.
mm,
And to that I wasn't a disappointment, that I wasn't betraying, my family, and that I wasn't doing anything wrong. And so for me, that was a really powerful and transformative conversation to recognize that like I actually did not have to feel like I wasn't enough or unworthy or unlovable. In fact, I not only was I not doing anything wrong, but I was like in love and it was super beautiful. So
mm,
creating space for like other folks to relinquish some of their, guilt, shame, insecurities about the stuff that they're doing that actually doesn't harm anyone.
mm.
And also recognizing that if they are doing something and they know that they're doing something, and oftentimes we always know, right? Like we
Yeah.
feel the thing in our bellies or in our
Mm,
tightness in our chest, right? And so also saying like, oh my God, I did this thing and it was like really bad. And that's not who I see myself as in the world. That's not who I want to be. But creating space for people to hold themselves accountable and say, I'm going to do better next time. I
mm,
am worthy enough. I care enough to be able to be self-critical and self-aware and say, yep, I messed up. Next time, I'm not going to make that same mistake. I'm going to do better. I'm going to be better,
mm,
right? And so not feeling like I messed up, I'm bad, and I'm either going to punish myself or I'm going to punish you, but I messed up and I believe in myself enough. I am worthy enough to fix this
mm,
error. I am good enough to do this. I'm capable enough to do this. And I think for me, that's like the conversation that I feel really inspired by because I also want people to offer me that same grace because none of us are infallible. And so I'm going to
mm,
make mistakes too. And when I make mistakes, I want to feel like that I have the opportunity to like fix it or to
mm.
do better next time, even if I can't fix what's happened before. So I know that was a little long-winded, but hopefully that gets at that question.
Yeah. That was super inspiring and very powerful. And it's funny that, we're on a podcast talking about work and career and desires that people have, whether that's financial or societal, and, you know, based on where they want to be and who they want to be. But really, at the end of the day, beneath all of it are those three questions that you brought up, like, am I normal? Am I enough? What was the other one?
Am I lovable?
Am I lovable? And I'm sure that no matter who you talk to, regardless of how much money they have, what position they have, or, you know, the amount of respect that they have, they're still asking those three questions. And life is about answering those in a way that feels satisfactory for them. So I'm really, really glad that you brought that up. And I think it's important to talk about that. I'm biased, of course, because I'm studying to be a counselor, and you're in the field of relationships and humanness. But I wish that that message can be kind of reverberated around society for more people to hear.
I love the field of humanness. I like want that on a t-shirt. It
Yeah.
was so beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think that the more we can have conversations like that again get underneath the people's
Mm,
humanity, like, listen, I may not agree with you, but like the work that I do is to help you too. I also
mm,
don't want you soaking in your own shame, not only because I don't want you to hurt, but I know that if you're soaking in your own shame and you're externalizing that, you're also hurting me.
mm,
And so, I want us to be able to, help each other. So you might not like maybe agree with the work that I do or still think that we shouldn't talk about sex or porn or any of the things that I spend my life researching and thinking about. But I'm also doing it in service of helping you. I want your relationships to be better too. I want your
mm.
relationships to yourself and others to be better. I don't have an ego in this game.
Yeah.
As much as humans like don't have can't have egos in the game.
Yeah.
But by and large, yeah, the part that I love the most is just being able to help folks see themselves in new lights. I know that we're running out of time, but one of the other things that I love about my job is
Mm,
when I was growing up, I never saw myself as a PhD. I saw
mm,
myself as more of an MD doctor because I had like more, like a better understanding of what that was. But I didn't see myself as being like a professor. Somehow that seemed like a really foreign concept to me.
mm,
And being like a first generation college student, like it was all kind of mysterious and new. And so I just had a conversation with one of my students 2 weeks ago, and she was sitting across me. She's graduating this semester. And, she's wondering what to do next. And grad school like wasn't necessarily like on her radar, or maybe like just a master's. But everything that I've known about this student for 4 years, and especially the things that she was saying on my couch, I was like, oh my gosh, you sound like such a PhD.
Mm.
And she was like, no, no way. That's not me. That's not who I am. And I was like, all right, no problem. And then we kept talking and I was like, oh my gosh, like you just sound like such a PhD. Like I can just feel it oozing out of you. And she again was like a bit dismissive. And then I got an email like a few days later and it was like, maybe I could be a PhD.
Wow.
And so it's also like, right, like helping, whether I'm helping a student to see themselves as a PhD student, or I'm helping the person who maybe doesn't agree with me to see
Mm,
themselves in a new light, right? Like that's the part that I think is like the most exciting. And so I would say for students, try to break out of the tunnel vision,
mm,
and be curious about like, I wonder how I could see myself. Like, what would
mm,
that look like for me? Because for me, I was like, could I be a PhD in human
mm,
sexuality? Wait, I can't see myself as a professor. I still can't see myself as a gardener, but maybe it's going to happen one day. But just all the different ways, again, if life is long, all of the ways that we get to see
mm,
ourselves and reimagine ourselves and transform our lives
mm.
by being able to, reflect back some of the experiences that we've had.
So cool. So cool. I want to end with a fun question. I think you might have like a fun answer to this, but if you could describe your career journey in a book title, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, this is great.
Take your time to answer it.
Let me think. I mean, maybe there's like a colon after this part, but I feel like it would be like, wait, really?
Wait, really? That's
Wait,
great.
really? Maybe like colon. I'm just thinking of this, one of the my favorite academic articles that's called like there are no words for what we do, so we had to create them. And so it's
Mm,
like, wait, really? I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm really glad to do it.
great. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I think this was a wonderful conversation where we touched on so many different aspects to work and life and humanness. So thanks again for being a guest.
Oh, thank you so much. Good luck with everything. And thank you for all that you do to help support all the amazing students too.
Thank
I
you.
feel so grateful that I get to learn just as much from you. So yeah, we're all in this together.
Thank you.